I'm going to start out with a joke, something I don't do very often, but I was at a theology conference once, and I heard this joke, so kind of fit the sermon a little bit, so I'll see if you can follow along and figure out. These two guys were walking down the street. One of them was a Calvinist, one of them was an Arminian. And they're walking down the street, and the sidewalk was a little uneven, and they both tripped and fell. The Arminian got up and dusted himself off and said, "Wow, that was weird. Guess it just fell, got to keep going." The Calvinist tripped and got up and dusted himself off and said, "Well, I'm glad that's done with." I think Wayne got it. It's only a joke a theologian could enjoy. What that joke is getting at is two trains of thought about God's sovereignty. The one figure in the story, call him the Arminian, they tend to believe that God is not as intimately involved in the affairs of men. So if you trip on the sidewalk, you just tripped. It was just a chance thing. Calvinists, on the other hand, hardcore Calvinists, believe that every single thing that happens in our life is ordained by God. So when he tripped, he said, "Well, I'm glad that's done with because it was supposed to happen and now it has. Now I can move on to whatever lies ahead for me." Two trains of thought about how involved God is in our lives. And as we've worked through the story of Ruth so far in the gospel and the book of Ruth, I've said several times that throughout this story, one of the things we're going to see is that God's providential hand, his sovereign hand, has been working behind the scenes, leading Naomi and Ruth in every step they've taken. And if you haven't been as convinced of that so far in the book, I think as we look at our passage today, you're going to gain a much stronger understanding and see much deeper truth of the fact that God is involved sovereignly in every part of our lives. So let's take a look at the passage today. If you have your Bibles, please open to the book of Ruth, and we're in chapter 2. We're starting chapter 2 today, and I'd like to read the first 13 verses. I'm going to read in the NIV. Ruth chapter 2 starts by saying, "Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor.' Naomi said to her, 'Go ahead, my daughter.' So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. 'The Lord be with you.' 'The Lord bless you,' they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, 'Whose young woman is that?' The foreman replied, 'She is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi.' She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you, and whenever you are thirsty, go get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes, that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls. This passage starts with an interesting literary technique, and that is the person who will come to be the key to Naomi and Ruth's future blessings and help and good fortune is introduced right up front. Those of you who read novels and mystery novels and books, typically they kind of keep the mystery person hidden and they wait until the end of the story and then they reveal who the great person is in the book. Well, here, the writer of Ruth introduces right up front Boaz. As we read, a relative of Elimelech, meaning he was a relative of Naomi's, and he's a man of wealth. So he's presented right up front. And in actuality, this is not a fancy literary technique. The writer of Ruth brought him forward right at the beginning here so that when Boaz and Ruth meet a little bit later on, what seemed like a chance encounter is meant to show us that was actually God's providential hand at work. He wants us to know right up front that before any of this stuff happened, God had Boaz kind of queued up. He had him ready in the wings waiting for all this to happen. It's a way of showing that God was behind the work here. And if you need any more proof of that, look at what happens in verse 2. When Ruth proposes to Naomi that she go and find a field somewhere to go try to gather some wheat for herself, what it says in verse 3 is that as it turned out, the ESV says she just happened to come upon, I really like the King James, it says her hap was to light on a part of a field belonging to Boaz. Here he is. What a coincidence. Naomi wants to go out and try to glean in the fields, and it just so happens, Ruth wants to glean in the field, and it just so happens she goes to the field of Boaz. And if that's not enough, verse 4 says, just then, just at that exact moment, at the exact time that Ruth just happened to come upon his field, of all the fields in Bethlehem, of all the places Ruth could have gone, it just so happened that she chose this field, and when she chose that field, it just so happened that at that exact moment, Boaz arrives from Bethlehem. This is what I'm talking about. God's providential hand is at work here. He's bringing her to this specific field, and he's bringing Boaz at the exact time so that they would come together. I don't think this is a coincidence. When we read things like Psalm 115, verse 3, that says, our God is in the heavens, he does all that he pleases, or Proverbs 16:9 that says, the heart of man plans his ways, but the Lord establishes his steps. The Lord directs his steps. Even if he's going to trip on a sidewalk, the Lord directs his steps. Do you kind of get the idea that God is sovereignly at work in all the events of the world? If it's his world and he does whatever he pleases, he is directing things. There was a prime minister of Holland in the early 20th century named Abraham Kuyper, and he had a wonderful saying. He said, there is not 1 inch in the whole area of human existence of which Christ, the sovereign Lord of all, does not cry, it is mine. There's not 1 inch in this whole sovereign cosmos that the Lord Christ doesn't say, that's mine. That's mine. Everything is mine. You read Colossians 1:16, Hebrews 1:2. These both reveal, as well as other places, that all things in the world are under the sovereign lordship and rule of Christ. He rules over everything and orders all things according to his purposes. Does that change your perspective on the events of your life? Do you know that everything that's happened in your life, Christ has sovereignly ruled over it? This is important because we've been fed a steady diet of falsehood. Falsehoods that state either things happen by chance, there's no meaning behind them, things just happen by chance, or that we have the ability to determine our own fate. Both of those are false. They're mistruths. And I say that because both of them deny the presence and activity of a God who is intimately involved in all the affairs of mankind. If you believe things happen by chance or you make your own decisions in life, then you're basically saying there is no God. There's no God who is sovereign over the world. There's no God who is sovereign over my life. We are not helpless victims in a world of unconnected and random events, nor are we masters of our own domain. Rather, we live within a cosmos that God has created, God has ordered, God is directing, and He's doing so for His purposes, both in your life and for His kingdom work. Now, that idea is unsettling for some. It leads often to the thought or the idea that we're just merely pawns in a big chess game that God is playing up in heaven, and He's moving everything around just the way He wants. Or some people believe it makes us out to be just puppets on a string, and God is just directing everything we do, and we have no play in it. Well, those are mistruths as well. And I want to address this today because I believe the passage addresses it. And this is what it reveals. And this is what I want you to understand for today. What it reveals is that though God is sovereignly directing our lives, we, as His children, still have the freedom and the responsibility to act within His sovereignty. Let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about from the passage. In verses 4 to 8, when we read Boaz comes upon the scene and to his foreman, and he sees what's going on, and he asks a little bit about who the young woman is. He responds to that news. He responds to the situation at hand in accordance with God's will for the situation. We saw in verse 8 that he tells Ruth to go ahead, glean in the fields. Now, that kind of makes Boaz sound like a nice guy. But in actuality, he is following and is obeying God's command to him. And the command was given in Leviticus 23:22, where God said, "And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. Why? You shall leave them for the poor and the foreigner." This is a commandment of God's. Leave a little bit of stuff around the edges so the poor people can go and get some of the leftovers. That law showed God's concern for the poor and for the alien, but not everybody obeyed it. We know how humans are. Many unscrupulous landlords or landowners refused to allow the poor to do this. They wouldn't let the poor come on their land, or they would harvest the field right up to the very edge, therefore not leaving any leftovers for the poor and the aliens. But in the story, Boaz, whose name suggests one of valor, one of strength, one of moral goodness, this man has taken the personal responsibility to obey God's command. So though God is directing all things, he's sending Ruth here, he's sending Boaz here, God is directing things that are happening, Boaz is still responsible to obey his command. He could have said no, that would have been irresponsible. Even though God is directing things, he has to do what's right. And furthermore, we read in verse 9 that it indicates that he had warned the men not to molest Ruth, to stay away from her. And he had told Ruth to remain close to his maidens, where she could be protected. That demonstrates Boaz's obedience to God's commands to protect the innocent, to protect the poor, to protect the widows amongst us. For example, Deuteronomy 15:11 and Deuteronomy 27:19. Boaz is doing what he's supposed to do under the sovereignty of God. And the same way with Ruth, when she prepared to go glean the wheat from the fields, as we saw back in verse 2, she asked Naomi if that would be okay. Think about that. She is asking her elder if it would be okay to do this. That's a cultural and biblical deference to authority. Naomi is her elder, and she knows she's supposed to show her respect. And in the same way, in verse 10, when Ruth responds to Boaz's kindness, it says she bows down with her face to the ground and wonders, "Why have you been so good to me, Boaz?" That's an act of gratitude. That's an act of humility, which God desires of his children. So throughout this story with both Ruth and Boaz, we see that they are exercising their personal freedom and responsibility to obey God while living under his sovereign rule. God's sovereign hand is directing things, but when we think about God's sovereign hand directing things, it does not mean that we're mere puppets, unable to act on our own free will. Otherwise, we would never sin, would we? We do have freedom to act under God's sovereignty. We are responsible for our actions, despite the fact that God is sovereign. This is very important for us to understand. I want you to get this. The truth of God's providence, that's what we're talking about here. The reality of God's providence should not lead us to think fatalistically. Some people will say, "What's the use? What's the use of doing anything? What's the use of trying to do this? What's the use of trying to make decisions? God is just leading me here, there, everywhere. He has a goal in mind, and I have no choice in it." Well, in one sense, that's true. We can't alter God's plan. But on the other hand, we are not mindless robots programmed to do only what God wants. Again, the presence of sin quickly disproves that argument. This passage demonstrates that God's sovereignty does not constrict us, but it gives us the opportunity to act responsibly. More so, God's grace doesn't eliminate our freedom to act. Rather, it creates our freedom to act. God's sovereignty creates it. Let me explain that a little bit. And I apologize in advance. I got to lay a little heavy theology on you because it's the only way to understand this. So stick with me. Before we're born again, before we are saved, we do not have the capacity to act freely. Do you know that? Before you come to faith, you can't act freely. Do you know why? because Paul says in Romans 6 that before we're saved, we're slaves to sin. We're born slaves to sin. I don't know about you, but my understanding of slavery is you don't have any freedom. You don't have the ability to do what you want. A slave can't go up to his master and say, hey, I'm going to go to town today. When you're a slave, you're told what to do. You have no choice. And thus, when we're born as slaves to sin, in our natural state, we can only obey our master, who is Satan. We can only act in accordance with our sin nature, because that's all we have. We're slaves to it. And that's why Paul says in Romans 3:12, that in our natural state, there is no one who does good. No one, not even one. Why is that? Because we can't. We're slaves to sin. And even when people do things that look like good acts, they have selfish motives. They're not doing it purely out of a love for God because they can't. They're slaves to sin. But once we're born again, we're given a new nature, the nature of Christ. And that gives us now the freedom to do what's right. You see that? Before we're slaves to sin, we do not have the freedom to do what's right. But once born again, now we can. That's why Paul says in Romans 6:22, but now that you have been set free from sin and have become slaves to God, the fruit you get leads to sanctification and its end, eternal life. So whereas at one time we had no choice, we had no free will, now, as born-again believers, we are free to act in accordance with our new natures, and we can follow God's desires for us. And even more so, we are held responsible to. Under the dome of God's providential care, we are both able and responsible to obey Him. Karl Barth said, our life is under the global mandate of responsible freedom. One time when I was in graduate school here in New York, when I was in school for social work, I was doing a field placement at a children and family center in Park Slope. And I was working with a local public school as a social worker there. And if you know anything about social workers in school, you have one main job. The teachers take the very, very worst kids in every class and they say, go see that guy, he's going to straighten you out. So I get like 15, this is middle school, so you can imagine what this is like. 15 middle school boys thrown in a room with me, and they say, fix these kids. Do something with the very worst of the kids. They're crazy. They're out of control. So one day, I have a bright idea. We're going to go to the park. Okay, we're going to go to Prospect Park, have a picnic. You know, that's a smart idea, but I thought it'd be nice. It was the end of the year. Let's have a little picnic, guys. So I got permission from the teachers, got permission from parents, all that stuff you have to do. Get stuff together, buy food. Okay, guys, come on. And we start out. And the minute we get outside the walls of that school, they're just like, they're free, away from school. And they went completely crazy. They're running down the streets. They're running up and down the avenues. They're knocking garbage pails over. They're jumping on cars. I'm thinking this was a bad idea. But I had this goal in mind. And I'm saying, guys, we are going to that park. And we are having a picnic. And I don't care what you think. We are going. So like in this story, this is an allegory, okay? I'm God. And I'm saying, we're getting to that park. I'm telling you, I don't care what it takes. You're going to be in that park with me this afternoon for a picnic. Now they are not acting very responsible in their freedom. And I have to keep stopping and calling them together. Come on, guys. Hey, come over here. Stop. Get over here. And I got to talk to them and give them a little lecture and say, come on, you can't do that. Stop that. Or, okay, yes, Mr. Knowles, okay. And then 5 minutes later, whoosh, they're out running off again. Come on, guys, come back. Now, we eventually got to that part, and we had a picnic. But it took a long time to get there. And it was constantly being delayed and held up because of their irresponsibility. And that's kind of like what life is, living under God's sovereign care. God is going to get us where He's going to get us. He has a goal for your life. He has a purpose for this church. And depending on how we play along with that, it can either go hard or it can go easy. And that's what I was trying to get across to these kids. If you just follow me, if you just obey me, if you listen to me, we'll get to the park sooner. We'll have more time to have fun. But they didn't want to hear that because they wanted to do crazy stuff with their freedom. But that's how it works with us in God's sovereignty. God's will doesn't change. He has a plan in mind. And we can fight Him, and it'll go hard for us in life. Or we can obey Him, and it'll go easy for us in life. God's will never change, but the way we respond within it will affect how it goes for us in life. And this, again, always leads to the classic question people have contemplating God's sovereignty. So then why should we bother living obediently? Why should I obey God's commands if He's going to take me from here to there anyway? Well, actually, Boaz answers that for us in his prayer for Ruth in verse 12, which we read. He said, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done." She's been responsible. May the Lord repay you for being a responsible person. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. This is a simple reiteration of the biblical truth that God blesses obedience. God blesses obedience. He has rich rewards for those who follow His commands. That's why when we obey Him, life goes so much better, because He blesses us as we obey His commands. When we live responsibly with our freedom, rather than sinfully with our freedom, things go much better for us. And as we do, we get to experience this amazing blessing of God that Boaz mentions, that is finding refuge under His wings. That's a picture of us living in obedience, responsibility with God. We're cuddled and sheltered under His protective wings. Throughout the Bible, and really the Psalms in particular, there are many references to God's wings. Psalm 17:8 describes them as a place of safety. Psalm 36:7, they're a place of refreshment. Psalm 57:1, they're a place of stillness in a storm. Psalm 63:7, they're a place of help and relaxation. And Psalm 91:4, they're a place of protection when danger surrounds us. Think of what this would have meant to Ruth in her life, how it's gone so far. She's been through deep turmoil, real problems. She's been constantly on the move, probably anxious, emotionally drained. Now she's a widow in a foreign land where she doesn't know anyone. She's probably facing starvation. And not only that, she's under constant threat of molestation, according to the passage. How she needs a place of safety a place of stillness, a place of help, a place of hope. And all of that is found under God's sovereign and gracious wings. You know, I know every one of us here have trials. We have struggles. We have afflictions, don't we? And we need a place of refuge. It comes from God as we live obediently under His sovereign care. Isn't it good and satisfying to know that there's a sovereign and wise God behind all of this, even our trials, even our difficulties, and that He is one that not only rules, but cares and provides for each one of us, sheltering them under the protective safety of His wings. The sovereign God who is directing all things is not a cold and calculating God who's just moving things around for His purposes and gain. He's not a God who's just trying to get His own way. He's not a God who's just moving chess pieces around on a board to get us where He wants us to be. He's a good, loving, caring God who is leading us in the best possible way for His purposes in our life and in His kingdom, even though we may not see it at the moment. What He calls us to do is to trust Him and follow Him and live responsibly as we do. May God grant us the courage and the will to live as such under the sovereign care of His wings.